My name is Rabbi David Levinson. I am 57 years old and have served Congregation Beth Shalom faithfully for 32 years here in Beechwood, just outside Cleveland, Ohio. For over 3 decades, I've stood before my congregation every Shabbat, sharing the wisdom of Torah, guiding souls toward righteousness, and believing I understood the heart of God. I was wrong about so many things. On September 18th, 2025, just 5 days ago as I record this testimony, something happened that shattered everything I thought I knew about faith, about God's plan, and about what it truly means to be chosen. It was a typical Wednesday evening. I had just finished leading our weekly Torah study group, a gathering of about 15 faithful souls who came every week to wrestle with the ancient texts. We had been studying the book of Malachi, specifically chapter 3, verse 6. I, the Lord, do not change. So you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. The irony of that verse haunts me now, because I was about to discover just how much I needed to change. After the study group left around 9:30 p.m., I remained behind in my office, as was my custom. The synagogue at night has always been my sanctuary, quiet, peaceful, filled with the lingering prayers of generations. That night I was preparing my sermon for the upcoming Rosh Hashanah services. The theme was returning to the heart of the covenant. How fitting that would prove to be, though not in the way I had planned. I was hunched over my desk, surrounded by commentaries, my reading glasses perched on my nose, when I felt it. A sharp, searing pain in my chest, like a knife being driven directly into my heart. At first, I thought it was just indigestion, but this pain was different, deeper, more profound. It radiated down my left arm and up into my jaw. I knew immediately what was happening. My father had died of a heart attack at 59, and my grandfather at 61. The Levinson men, it seemed, were not built for longevity. I tried to reach for my phone, but my hand wouldn't obey. The room began to spin, the familiar Hebrew texts on my shelves blurring into indecipherable shapes. I felt myself falling forward, my face hitting the open pages of my sermon notes. The last thing I remember thinking was a fragment of the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But death, as I was about to learn, was not the end of the story. Rabbi Cohen, my assistant who had been locking up the classrooms, heard the thud of my body hitting the desk. He rushed into my office and found me unconscious, my lips already turning blue, no pulse detectable in my wrist or neck. He immediately called 911 while beginning CPR, something he had learned years ago but never imagined he would need to use on his senior rabbi. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, which in Cleveland traffic on a Wednesday night was practically miraculous. They worked on me for nearly 20 minutes, administering electric shocks, injecting medications, manually compressing my chest. According to the medical report, I would later read, my heart had completely stopped. No electrical activity, no blood flow to my brain. For 17 minutes and 34 seconds, by every medical definition, I was dead. But I wasn't really dead. I was more alive than I had ever been. The moment my heart stopped, I felt myself lifting. Not dramatically, not with any sense of urgency or fear, but gently, like a soap bubble rising from a child's hands. I was suddenly outside my body, floating about 6 feet above the scene, watching the paramedics work frantically on what I now understood was just the shell I had inhabited for 57 years. It was the strangest thing. I felt no attachment to that body anymore. It looked smaller than I expected, older, more fragile. Rabbi Cohen was standing in the corner, his face pale with shock, his lips moving in silent prayer. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that he didn't need to worry, but I had no voice that he could hear. The room began to fade around the edges, like an old photograph slowly dissolving. The paramedics' voices grew distant, their movements slowing until they seemed frozen in time. And then I was moving. Not walking, not flying, but simply being drawn by an invisible force that was both irresistible and completely comforting. I found myself in what I can only describe as a tunnel, though that word doesn't do justice to the experience. It wasn't dark and frightening like the near-death experiences I had read about in books. Instead, it was filled with a soft, swirling light that seemed alive, breathing, welcoming. The walls, if they were walls, seemed to be made of pearl and gold, shifting and dancing with colors I had never seen before, colors that don't exist in our earthly spectrum. As I moved through this tunnel, I began to hear voices. Not scary or overwhelming voices, but gentle whispers in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in languages I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They were prayers, thousands upon thousands of prayers, rising like incense, carrying the hopes and fears and gratitude of countless souls. I heard my own grandmother's voice among them, the woman who had taught me my first Hebrew words, who had died when I was 12. She was praying for me, thanking God for my faithfulness, asking Him to guide my steps in whatever lay ahead. The tunnel began to open, widening like the mouth of a great cave, and I emerged into a space that defied all description. There were no walls, no ceiling, no floor, just pure, brilliant, living light. It was brighter than the sun, yet it didn't hurt my eyes. Instead, it felt like breathing, like coming home after a long journey, like being embraced by love itself. And there He was. I knew instantly it was Jesus, though He looked nothing like the pictures I had seen in Christian books or the images that decorated their churches. There were no flowing robes, no crown of thorns, no gentle European features. His form was light itself, pure, radiant energy that somehow contained infinite compassion, perfect justice, and overwhelming love. Looking at Him was like looking at the source of all light, all truth, all goodness that had ever existed. When He spoke, it wasn't with a voice that entered through my ears. Instead, His words bloomed directly in my soul, bypassing all the filters and defenses I had built up over decades of theological study. His voice was a thought, a feeling, a perfect understanding that resonated in every fiber of my being. "David," He said, and in that single word I heard my entire life story. Every prayer I had prayed, every sermon I had delivered, every doubt I had wrestled with in the dark hours before dawn. "I have brought you here to receive a message for my people." I wanted to respond, to ask questions, to engage Him in the kind of theological debate I was used to having with my colleagues. But all I could do was weep, not from sadness, but from a relief so profound it shook me to my core. Every burden I had carried for 32 years of ministry, the weight of other people's spiritual struggles, the pressure to have all the answers, the secret fear that maybe I was leading people down the wrong path, all of it simply fell away. In His presence, I felt completely known and completely accepted. He saw every flaw, every moment of pride, every time I had chosen ritual over compassion, tradition over mercy. And yet his love for me never wavered. It was unconditional, unshakable, transformative. But I was not there for my own comfort. He had a message, a warning, a revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about God's plan for the end times. And as the vision began to unfold before my eyes, I realized that October 2025 was not just another month on the calendar. It was the moment when everything would change, when the sheep would be separated from the goats, when the chosen would be revealed, and the lost would be left behind. Jesus didn't speak another word. Instead, he simply gestured with his hand, and suddenly we were no longer standing in that brilliant space of light. The scene shifted, and I found myself witnessing events that had not yet occurred, but would unfold with terrible precision in just 7 days from this very moment. I was watching October 1st, 2025, dawn breaking across the earth like any other morning. People woke up, made their coffee, checked their phones, complained about traffic, went about their routines completely unaware that this day would mark the beginning of the greatest separation in human history since Noah's flood. But I could see what they could not. I could see the invisible spiritual realm overlaying the physical world like a transparent map. Golden threads of light connected certain people, threads that pulsed with prayer, with genuine love for God, with hearts turned toward mercy rather than judgment. These threads formed a vast network spanning the globe, connecting believers who had never met but who shared the same spirit of humble devotion. Jesus spoke into my mind, "Behold, David, the separation has already begun in the hearts of my people. October will simply make visible what has been invisible." I watched as these golden threads began to glow brighter and brighter. The people connected by them, and I was amazed to see they were predominantly older believers, men and women over 50, who had weathered life's storms with faith intact, began to experience what I can only describe as a spiritual awakening. Not emotional hysteria or religious fervor, but a quiet, profound settling of their souls into perfect peace. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, age 63, a retired school teacher in Portland, Oregon, was sitting in her small kitchen having her morning devotions when the change came over her. She had been praying for her wayward son Michael for 15 years. He was addicted to drugs, had stolen money from her repeatedly, and hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. But every morning, without fail, she prayed for his salvation. As I watched, a warm golden light surrounded her, and suddenly she knew, not hoped, but knew, that her prayers had been heard and would be answered. The bitterness she had carried, the disappointment that had eaten at her heart, simply dissolved. She was filled with such peace that she began to weep with joy. David Chen, 58, a janitor at a Baptist church in Houston, Texas, was mopping the sanctuary floors when the light touched him. For 23 years, he had cleaned that church faithfully, never seeking recognition, never complaining about his low wages, always arriving early and staying late. He had been overlooked for deacon positions, passed over for leadership roles because he wasn't educated or articulate enough. But his heart was pure gold. As the light enveloped him, he suddenly understood that his faithful service, every toilet he had scrubbed, every floor he had mopped, every act of humble devotion, had been a form of worship more precious to God than all the eloquent sermons ever preached from that pulpit. Sister Margaret O'Brien, 71, a Catholic nun who had spent 45 years caring for orphans in inner-city Detroit, felt the transformation as she was changing the diaper of a crack-addicted baby. She had seen so much suffering, so much injustice, had sometimes wondered if God was really listening to her prayers. But in that moment, surrounded by golden light, she saw the eternal impact of every child she had comforted, every meal she had prepared, every prayer she had whispered over sleeping infants. She saw their lives stretching out before them, how her love would echo through generations, breaking cycles of abuse and neglect. These people, and thousands like them, were being sealed with a mark invisible to human eyes, but blazingly obvious in the spiritual realm. They glowed with an inner light that made them look like walking stars. But then Jesus showed me the other side. I saw pastors, rabbis, priests, and ministers who had spent decades building impressive ministries, accumulating wealth and influence, but whose hearts had grown cold toward the very people they claimed to serve. I watched as they woke up on October 1st, feeling nothing. No divine presence, no inner peace, no golden light, just emptiness, where God's Spirit used to dwell. Pastor William Harrison of Magnificent Grace Megachurch in Dallas, a congregation of 15,000 members and a television ministry reaching millions, stood in his marble bathroom looking at himself in the mirror, and for the first time in years, he truly saw himself. His $3,000 suit, his perfect smile, his carefully styled hair, all of it seemed like a costume now. He remembered when he first felt called to ministry 30 years ago, how he had wept over lost souls, how he had given away his last dollar to help a struggling family. When had that changed? When had building his empire become more important than loving people? He tried to pray, but the words felt hollow, bouncing off the ceiling like rubber balls. The connection was gone. He was no longer sealed. Rabbi Sarah Goldman of Temple Beth El in Manhattan, a brilliant woman who had written 3 books on progressive Judaism and was a frequent guest on television programs, felt the same terrible emptiness. She had spent the last decade fighting traditional interpretations of Scripture, arguing that God's standards had evolved with the times, that what was considered sin in ancient times was now just alternative lifestyle choices. She had been so proud of her intellectual sophistication, her ability to make faith relevant to modern audiences. But now, standing in her luxurious apartment overlooking Central Park, she felt spiritually bankrupt. The golden threads that had once connected her to the Almighty had been severed by her own hand. One compromise at a time. Father Antonio Rodriguez, who had served St. Mary's Catholic Church in Phoenix for 22 years, tried to celebrate morning Mass as usual, but something was wrong. As he lifted the Eucharist, his hands trembled, not with reverence, but with the sudden, terrifying realization that he no longer believed the words he was speaking. Years of covering up scandals in the church, years of protecting the institution rather than the innocent, years of choosing political correctness over biblical truth had hardened his heart until it was like stone. But it wasn't just the clergy. I saw millions of churchgoers, synagogue members, mosque attendees, people who had spent decades showing up to religious services but whose hearts had never truly surrendered to God. They had gone through the motions, said the right words, performed the right rituals, but had never experienced genuine transformation. Then Jesus showed me what would happen as October progressed. The sealed ones, those marked with golden light, began to experience miraculous protection and provision. Not because they were more deserving, but because they had hearts positioned to receive God's grace. When economic chaos erupted in mid-October, These faithful believers found themselves supernaturally provided for. Money appeared in their accounts from unexpected sources. Job opportunities opened up just when they needed them. Their health improved dramatically, chronic conditions healed, minds became sharp and clear. But more importantly, they became spiritual lighthouses in communities plunging into darkness. As fear and panic spread, these sealed believers radiated supernatural peace. Their faith became contagious. People began seeking them out, asking what was different about them, begging to know their secret. Mrs. Morrison's drug-addicted son, Michael, showed up at her door on October 12th, broken and desperate, ready for the first time in years to listen to what his mother had been trying to tell him about God's love. Because of her seal, her words carried supernatural power. By the end of that conversation, Michael had genuinely surrendered his life to Christ, not just said the words, but experienced true heart transformation. David Chen found himself counseling dozens of people who came to him, not because he was educated or eloquent, but because the presence of God that surrounded him drew them like moths to flame. His simple faith and genuine love broke through barriers that years of professional counseling had failed to penetrate. Sister Margaret discovered that the children in her care were developing at an accelerated rate, physically, mentally, and spiritually. It was as if the light that surrounded her was nurturing them in ways that defied medical explanation. But those who were not sealed faced a very different October. As global instability increased, economic collapse, natural disasters, social unrest, they found themselves increasingly isolated and afraid. Their comfortable religious routines provided no comfort. Their sophisticated theology offered no answers. Their impressive church buildings felt empty and cold. Pastor Harrison watched his megachurch attendance plummet as people instinctively sensed the absence of God's presence in his ministry. His television donations dried up. His board of directors began questioning his leadership. By October 20th, he was facing bankruptcy and public humiliation. Rabbi Goldman found herself unable to connect with her congregation. Her sermons felt flat and meaningless. Members began leaving for more traditional synagogues where they could find authentic spiritual nourishment. Her book contracts were canceled. Her television appearances were terminated. Father Rodriguez was removed from his position after a whistleblower exposed decades of his complicity in covering up abuse cases. As he packed his belongings from the rectory, he realized that he had lost not just his career, but his soul. Jesus turned to me, his face filled with infinite sadness. "The separation is not my judgment, David. It is the natural consequence of choices made over years and decades. Those who chose mercy over judgment, love over law, humility over pride, they positioned themselves to receive my protection. Those who chose the opposite path cut themselves off from my grace." "But why October?" I asked. "Why this specific time?" "Because October 2025 marks the end of an era of grace," he replied. "For years I have been calling my people back to the heart of the covenant, to love me with all their hearts and to love their neighbors as themselves. October is the deadline I set for this calling. After October, the wheat and the chaff will be permanently separated. The sealed will shine ever brighter, becoming lights in an increasingly dark world. The unsealed will sink deeper into darkness, having rejected their final opportunity for redemption." He then showed me the 3 specific criteria that determined who would be sealed and who would be lost. First, he looked at the heart, not the external appearance. Those who harbored bitterness, unforgiveness, pride, or judgment toward others could not be sealed, regardless of their theological knowledge or religious position. Conversely, those who maintained hearts of mercy, forgiveness, and genuine love for others would be sealed, regardless of their worldly status or religious education. Second, love must be demonstrated in actions, not just words. The sealed ones were people who had consistently, sacrificially served others, often quietly and without recognition. They had fed the hungry, visited the lonely, cared for the sick, supported the struggling. They had chosen to give when they could have kept, to serve when they could have been served, to love when they could have judged. Third, those who had spent their lives promoting themselves, building their own kingdoms, seeking recognition and honor from men, could not be sealed. But those who had been content to serve in obscurity, to let others receive credit, to consider others more important than themselves, these were his chosen ones. As the vision continued, I watched the final days of October unfold. The sealed ones became increasingly powerful spiritual forces in their communities, performing miracles, leading mass conversions, providing supernatural comfort and guidance during global chaos. But the unsealed, especially religious leaders who had built their identities on their spiritual authority, faced devastating humiliation as their emptiness became apparent to all. By October 31st, the separation was complete and irreversible. Hearts that had chosen love, mercy, and humility over the previous decades were permanently sealed for protection and blessing. Hearts that had chosen pride, judgment, and selfishness were permanently hardened in their chosen direction. "Now you understand," Jesus said to me as the vision faded, "why I am sending you back with this warning. 7 days remain for people to examine their hearts and choose their eternal destiny. 7 days for pride to become humility, for bitterness to become forgiveness, for selfishness to become love." After October 31st, the opportunity for heart change will be gone forever. The weight of this message crashed down on me like a tidal wave. In just 1 week, the most important spiritual deadline in human history would pass. And I had been chosen to sound the alarm while there was still time. Jesus then gave me specific instructions for 3 groups of people. To the religious leaders, pastors, priests, rabbis, ministers, he told me to say they must examine their motives honestly. Are they serving him, or are they serving themselves? Are they shepherding his flock, or are they building their own kingdoms? If they discover selfish ambition in their hearts, they must repent immediately and begin serving in humility. They must give away their excess wealth, care personally for the poor and suffering in their communities, and stop treating their ministries like businesses. To the ordinary church members, those who attend services but have never truly surrendered their hearts, he said to tell them that showing up is not enough. Being raised in a Christian family is not enough. Knowing Bible verses is not enough. They must have a genuine heart transformation, demonstrated by sacrificial love for others. If their faith has been merely cultural or social, they must experience true spiritual rebirth in the next 7 days. To the lost, those who have rejected him entirely or who follow other religions, he told me to say that he is the only way to the Father, but his door is still open for 7 more days. After October 31st, the offer of salvation will be withdrawn forever. This is their final opportunity to receive eternal life. Remember David, Jesus said as I felt myself being pulled back toward my body. 7 days. 7 days to transform hearts. 7 days to choose eternity. 7 days until the deadline that cannot be extended. The journey back was much faster than the journey to his presence. I rushed through the tunnel of light, past the swirling colors and the whispered prayers, back toward my broken physical body lying in the emergency room of Cleveland General Hospital. The collision with my earthly flesh was jarring and painful. I gasped, my lungs filling with air for the first time in 17 minutes and 34 seconds. The medical monitors began beeping frantically as my heart resumed beating with a strong, steady rhythm. "He's back!" shouted Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency room physician who had been overseeing my resuscitation. "I've never seen anything like this." He was completely flatlined for over 17 minutes, and now his vitals are completely normal. Rabbi Cohen was standing in the corner, his face wet with tears. When our eyes met, he rushed to my bedside. "David, thank God you're alive. We thought we'd lost you." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw from the intubation tube. A nurse brought me ice chips, and after a few minutes I was able to whisper, "I have a message from Jesus." The medical staff exchanged glances. Dr. Chen checked my pupils with her flashlight and ordered a CT scan of my brain. "It's not uncommon for cardiac arrest patients to experience hallucinations," she explained gently. "The lack of oxygen to the brain can cause very vivid dreams that seem completely real. But I knew what I had experienced was no hallucination. The memory was too detailed, too consistent, too profound to be the product of an oxygen-deprived brain. And more importantly, I could feel the lingering presence of Jesus even in this sterile hospital room. Over the next 3 days, as I recovered my physical strength, I began sharing my experience with everyone who would listen. The medical staff remained skeptical, but I could see the spiritual hunger in their eyes. Nurse Patricia Williams, a Baptist who had been struggling with her faith after her husband's death from cancer, began weeping as I described the golden light that surrounded truly faithful believers. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, she had rededicated her life to Christ and began volunteering at a homeless shelter. Rabbi Cohen was the first person to fully believe my testimony. "I've known you for 15 years, David," he said. "You're the most grounded, rational person I've ever met. If you say Jesus spoke to you, then I believe he did. What do we do with this message?" I knew I had to share it widely, but I also knew that time was running out. October 31st was now just 4 days away. I began making phone calls to every rabbi, pastor, and priest I knew, sharing the warning and pleading with them to examine their hearts. Some listened respectfully, but did nothing. Others hung up on me, or suggested I seek psychological counseling. But a few, a precious few, took the message seriously. Rabbi Michael Goldstein from Temple Beth Torah in Chicago called me back 3 hours after our initial conversation. "David," he said, "I haven't been able to stop thinking about what you told me. I've been examining my heart, and I'm horrified by what I've found. I've been more concerned about impressing my board of directors than serving God. I've been jealous of rabbis with larger congregations. I've been prideful about my education and condescending toward less educated believers. If what you've seen is true, I need to change immediately." Over the next 2 days, Rabbi Goldstein gave away $50,000 from his personal savings to help struggling families in his community. He began visiting hospitals and nursing homes, caring personally for the sick and elderly. He publicly confessed his pride and asked his congregation for forgiveness. And on October 30th, He called to tell me that he had experienced something extraordinary during his morning prayers, a sense of golden light surrounding him, a deep peace he had never felt before, a certainty that he had been forgiven and sealed. Pastor Jennifer Martinez from Grace Community Church in Phoenix had a similar experience. After hearing my testimony, she realized that her ministry had become more about building her personal brand than serving Christ. She deleted her social media accounts, canceled her book deal, and began spending her days serving meals at a homeless shelter. On October 31st, just hours before the deadline, she felt the same golden light that Rabbi Goldstein had described. But for every success story, there were dozens of rejections. As October 31st dawned, I felt a mixture of urgency and heartbreak. The deadline was just hours away, and so many people, good people, religious people, people I loved and respected, remained unsealed because they couldn't humble themselves enough to receive the message. I spent the final day calling everyone on my contact list one last time. Some hung up immediately when they heard my voice. Others listened politely, but remained unconvinced. A few, precious few, experienced last-minute heart transformation and received the seal of God. At 11:58 p.m. Eastern Time on October 31st, I was on my knees in my synagogue, praying for those who had rejected the warning. As the clock struck midnight on November 1st, I felt something shift in the spiritual atmosphere, like a great door closing with a sound that echoed through eternity. It was finished. The deadline had passed. Hearts were now permanently fixed in their chosen direction. Now, as I record this testimony, it is November 15th, 2025. The separation Jesus showed me has begun to manifest in exactly the ways he predicted. The sealed believers are experiencing supernatural protection, provision, and spiritual power. They are becoming lights in communities growing increasingly dark. But the unsealed, even many who held religious positions and considered themselves faithful believers, are struggling with spiritual emptiness, confusion, and despair as the world grows more chaotic around them. I share this testimony not to bring condemnation, but to bear witness to the reality of what I experienced. The vision I received was terrifying in its finality, but also beautiful in its revelation of God's perfect justice and mercy. Those who chose love over hate, humility over pride, service over selfishness, are now marked for eternal blessing. Those who chose the opposite path face the consequences of their own choices. The separation is complete. The chosen have been revealed, and eternity has begun.